for Global Health on the advocacy team to continue my work and start making bigger changes at a national level. And now I'm going to pass it over to the other co-host, who is Hannah.
Hi everyone, I'm Hannah. I'm a fifth year medical student at Oxford, and I've worked with Students for Global Health for a while now at a local and international level, and recently set up a branch at my university. So it's being aware of the devastating impact climate change will have on the health of people on our planet that motivated me to join our national working group. And it's really helped me find my place as part of the movement fighting for climate justice and taking action to prevent climate breakdown. And I've met some amazing people and learnt a lot, and I'm really excited to be here today as well.
Okay, so today we're going to be discussing international climate justice, which is the fair treatment of all people and the freedom from discrimination and the creation of policies and projects that address climate change. And we will be introducing how climate change affects people globally, focusing on Indigenous people's health.
So today we're talking to Nadiah, who's the co-founder of Klima Action Malaysia, or KAMI, which is a climate justice movement led by youth focusing on the intersectionalities of climate impacts. They call for inclusive climate action in Malaysia by empowering the grassroots and vulnerable groups, including youth, women, and frontline Indigenous communities, and also facilitate civil society groups of various backgrounds in improving the collective understanding of climate impacts to mobilise the proclamation of a climate emergency in Malaysia. So we'll just start talking to Nadiah now.
So yeah, Nadiah, if you could start by telling us a bit more about your work and what you do.
Hi everyone. My name is Nadiah. I'm sorry, my internet is a bit wobbly at the moment, but I hope it's going to be fine for the next 1 hour. I'm from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. I am one of the co-founders of Klima Action Malaysia. It's actually, Klima means, climate in German. I used to study it in Germany before I went back home. We started off as a movement. We were basically born on the streets, in Kuala Lumpur during the first climate strike, global climate strike in 2019. But basically, I was already working. I was already working in the grassroots I was organizing activities with communities, mostly indigenous communities. It has never. I never really started off as a climate, so to speak, activist. I was working with indigenous communities to help them set up committees and aid them in for example, mapping their territories, collecting aid, for example, when they were erected their blockades against developers or loggers and things like that. So I was mainly doing that, and hence I was very much exposed to their philosophy of life, their relationship with nature, human, everything around them, and how the ecological degradation has impacted the way they has impacted their resistance, mentally and physically. Their resilience is eroded quite in ways that we could never even imagine or understood. So that is how it went. So what happened was that in 2019, I think back in 2017 or 18, if I'm not mistaken, I've seen how people are starting to speak in bolder terms. They are starting to do more direct action on in the climate agenda. Basically, people are going down the streets, and I saw there's a global traction, and I thought, okay, why not? Let's try to make it this time around. Let's try to make space for vulnerable communities to enrich the climate movement, basically. And at that point, we don't have any vulnerable communities speaking in the climate movement, especially in Malaysia. So it was quite a hard thing to start on, as perhaps it does not seem normal to you guys, but climate science, or anything that is related to climate, has always been a domain of the urban, speaking communities. It's very urbanized. The narrative has taken is very is in English. All materials are in English, so we assume that it's um, you know the narrative, the dialogue has always been centered on urban communities. And we started to we faced a lot of challenge, quite how do I say this, uh, it was really challenging, particularly in terms of the language, trying to simplify all this complex climate information, and try to bring this forward and try to make the average people understand what is actually climate change. And until today, Malaysia does not have, we don't have um, a an official direct policy, or I would say health intervention in terms of climate impacts here in Malaysia. We still don't have that. There's no climate education. There's no blueprint or any plans by the government to include climate in any kind of primary, secondary, or tertiary education. So it was a really huge challenge, trying to first trying to educate the people, and then try to make them understand, try to make things relevant for them to understand, and then empowering them for action itself. So yeah. So here I am. Yeah.
And how is climate change affecting Indigenous communities in Malaysia, and how is that different to how it's affecting non-Indigenous communities?
So the Indigenous communities in Malaysia, in particular in Malaysia, are some of the poorest in the community. They are marginalized and also vulnerable to a lot of this, I would say, policy that is rooted in racism in Malaysia. So because they are the minority, and they were denied basic rights, for example, rights to education, rights to quality healthcare, rights to infrastructure, for example, a simple road, electricity, water, sanitation is not accessible to them. And whenever people, I mean, like people living in urban area, and suddenly they have to, they went to an indigenous village, and normally people couldn't cope because the situation is so bad. And it was quite an eye-opening you know moment for me when I first went to an indigenous village, having to listen to the stories firsthand. As I said, they are facing a lot of this kind of different stresses, and there's also a gap of knowledge, basically, in terms of you know um, all the impacts that they've been seeing, they've been feeling, is not really documented properly. Hence, there are very little documentation, peer-to-peer journals that we can read about how indigenous communities are impacted by climate, by the warming climate. But indigenous communities themselves, they don't have that kind of documentation like we non-indigenous people do. Like they don't write documents and things like that. They pass through this oral knowledge, for example, they sing, um, and things like that. And from some of the research that me and my team have done on the field, so we went to various indigenous communities trying to collect all this small data and try to make sense. We do sometimes try to weave in more of the scientific kind of methodology to collect our data, but we realize that it needs to be viewed a bit differently, because there's this one thing called um, ethno knowledge, this indigenous knowledge. It's hard to document, and you need to really dive down and think about their philosophy, different way of thinking, so that you can try to make sense of what's happening, especially when it comes to the changing weather, how medicines that is available for them in the forest itself has been disappearing, and thus the indigenous knowledge disappearing, eroding themselves. It's quite I think there's a lot of people who's working with indigenous communities, not only in Malaysia, is having the same problem. The problem to document things as fast as they can, because the climate is changing really dramatically over here, and especially with ecological degradation in terms of log deforestation and etc. um, and also the other stresses like not having basic necessities really push these communities into being marginalized completely. And there's also the issue of trust, them not trusting the government, not trusting outsiders is also quite problematic. But we understand that it's due to all this systemic oppression that they've been facing, being denied rights and etc. So there's a lot of work to be done here, but I'm really glad that there's a lot of other organizations that has been working in trying to bridge this gap of understanding, but it's been really slow. The progress has been really slow, and we all know how we're going to reach. We're going to move past beyond that 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, possibly in the next 50, 70 years, especially so in Malaysia, in this part of the world. And we are. It's not looking very optimistic, unfortunately, over here. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I've briefly introduced the topic, but if you could go a little bit more into detail into what is climate justice to those of us who are not familiar with it.
Okay. Mm-hmm. When I first started off trying to explain climate justice to the younger members working in my team, it was like quite a struggle, because climate justice is a really new concept. People, when they thought about climate justice, is it the justice for climate? It's really confusing. And actually, it's basically climate justice is the different ways of how climate impacts your life, impacts inequality, impacts it's basically, it differs, the concept of justice differs, geographically, culturally, in different places, um, globally, basically, because over here the kind of inequalities, there's a range of inequality that we can see, and there's quite a few studies trying to link how climate is related to this kind of inequalities, say poverty, health, education, gender. But these are the intersectionalities that is, even though that there are studies about them, but it's very much less um, discussed. So that is also very problematic. Like climate justice, the concept itself is a bit foreign here in Malaysia. There are studies done, not necessarily using the concept climate justice, but the intersectionalities. But somehow it's not being linked much to climate. How do I say this? Like they know the weather is changing, but they don't really use the term, climate justice or even climate change. And that is one. And another challenge that I saw as well when it comes to climate, impacts. People have always been talking about emissions, say, and I think that this is related to all the negotiations going on about how um, the global north, countries in the global north, um, has to pay for reparations, loss and damages. That's also another concept of climate justice that we saw, and but then it's not a concept much understood here in Malaysia. And I think to be fair, it's really complex in terms of trying to link it, to the inequalities that we've been seeing here in this part of the region, where everything is a bit it's complex. And yeah, it's the historical, cultural of being colonized as well. People don't really see, climate as much as, apart from just emissions. Yeah, so this is the kind of the discourse that the wall that that Kami or and other groups are trying to break, trying to make people understand that it's more than just emissions. It's about inequalities. It's also about um, you know um, wealth gap between nations and etc. So yeah.
Thank you for that
I hope that
answer.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Because I totally understand that whenever we wanted to talk about climate justice, we have to speak about the structures, the systems that brought us upon this destruction, right? But the elements to understanding this different um, you know um, to understand this different stresses, how do I say that the boundaries to this kind of the, 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 the the problems that has brought us to this um, situation. I don't want to call the situation a crisis. Is not yet understood here in this part of the world. Um, but then I'm really glad to have found connections around the world that allows me to learn more, to understand where we are at the moment. How do we make this relevant for our communities, especially our local indigenous, because the local indigenous, they how do I say this? They manage a huge chunk of land mass. I would say here in Malaysia, their territories are really massive, but they have no rights on it because customary land is not acknowledged by the Malaysian government. And to know that they hold so much, they are safeguarding this really important ecosystems, but then their rights are not being heard, uh, being denied by years of systemic oppression, violations of human rights. It really puts, um, how do I say, it really dampens the way how they think. um, Maybe I can speak more about the mental health a bit later. If you have any questions about that, how
That
the
would be
mental,
fantastic. That
yeah.
would be fantastic. Yeah. So I have a follow-up question. If you could tell
Right.
us more about what you said about reparations from the global north and south, and why some people are asking for that, and then maybe we can go into the mental health later.
Right.
Thank you.
So basically, the historically, emissions have been, how do I say, the carbon emission um, has been emitted by basically the global north countries, all these developed countries, for example, the States, Europe as a whole, and China. Right now, China and India is gaining up really fast, but nothing um, cannot compare. We can't compare the rise of China and India with the historical emission that is being, that we have seen for the past, if I'm not mistaken, 200 years since the industrial revolution. And so in the climate negotiations, so we saw that we can see that these countries, the global north, the countries that has emitted that much of carbon they fall under this Annex 1 countries. So in the Paris Agreement, they are obliged to, you know, to provide technical assistance to countries that is developing, and to, you know, shift away the economies of the developing countries to its decarbonizing, economy, decarbonized economy. And but then it has been really hard trying to negotiate for climate finance, trying to, get your hands into these funds, because it's well known in climate negotiations that there has been a bit of um, reluctance from governments, especially in the global north, to take up more responsibility in helping developing countries to move away from economies that is the sunset industries that is still economies that is still rooted in sunset economies like oil and gas, coal, and etc. And I think it's also well known that these smaller countries, when I say smaller, I would say the economy capacity, the GDP is much more lower. Um, they don't contribute much emission. For example, Malaysia just contribute over 0.7% of the global carbon emission, but the impacts are felt disproportionately in terms of the climate impacts. And maybe I can touch a bit on countries like, the Philippines, or who is a really huge archipelago, and the way that they've been bombarded with, typhoons, one after the other, back to back. And yeah, they don't contribute much to the carbon emission, but yet they felt they've suffered all this, the impacts, um, you know uh, rather disproportionately as compared to um, other states, other countries that has been contributing to the emissions, and that leads to the warming, the rise of global temperature. um, Having said that, there's also the island states, for example, like in Tuvalu, all these Pacific islands, that has already suffered through sea level rise, and having them to, um, and communities being displaced it's quite you know, tragic that to see that how they've been trying to bring their voice forward in all kinds of climate negotiations, and they've been doing that for decades, but still we are in the same situation. Progress is a bit slow, but the impacts are moving faster. So that is what I meant by, you know, the loss and damages, reparations from the global north to assist, you know, developing nations to shift away from you know, economies that is not sustainable for the planet, and also because, you know, they don't, developing countries don't necessarily have the funds, the capacity to first to adapt to climate, and also to mitigate mitigate yeah, climate change. So
Thank you. So I think now would be a great time to talk about the mental health of Indigenous communities that you just mentioned. So what's your organisation been doing on mental health, and how is that being affected by climate change in these communities?
So basically, whenever we run activities, we plan a campaign, or you know, go into field work, technical work, we really emphasize you know, the mental health impacts of these communities, in terms of you know, training our, you know, our members whenever we do work to understand why these communities are behaving in such a way that it's really difficult for us to even help them, you know. But then we, it's how do I say this? It's quite a complex situation, because not all tribes you know, face the same kind of stresses, so they have different ways of coping mechanism. And whenever, before we go to any kind of any villages, we set up this you know, we try to find out whether, you know, is this the right way to do things, you know, how to bridge the trust, how to build trust between us and communities. So trying to understand how they think and why they think that way is also, I consider it as you know, trying to um, you know, understand somehow what are their coping mechanisms, why they are behaving that way. And I think there's a, whenever we send aid, for example, you know, for example, whenever there's a say a climate disasters like flooding, we always make sure that there's also the psychosocial aid being addressed. Um, you know, we wanted to know if communities are um, you know, discussing. I think the main thing that we do in the psychosocial, you know, it is just to provide a platform for them to speak about their worries, um, you know, because precisely because they lack that kind of you know, help from the government. Just having a space for them to speak is quite you know, can be really detrimental, because you kind of keep it in, and then you don't have the trust towards outsiders, and yeah, you just kind of died inside, you know. And that's how communities, you know, the mental resilience are eroding really fast. And feeling like I think one of I met one in one of a, not a stakeholder meeting, but we met with this one community, and they said that you know, like he does not think that his culture will survive in the next, you know, in the next decade or so, because their people are ashamed of being an indigenous community. Imagine that they lost their sense of identity, they lost their sense of, you know, being even confident, um, you know, it's just so traumatic just to listen to that, wishing that they were somebody else, being born somebody else. It's just sad. And psychosocial aid is really really critical, especially after a disaster, like flooding occurs, because these people are traumatized by such events. They're not only, you know, losing, um, how do I say this, their you know, their houses being swept away and things like that, but it's just the feeling that, you know, knowing no help is coming. Sorry to sound like a bit vague. I'm trying hard to, you know, trying to generalize some of these impacts that's being seen. And but then those are the primary ones that we felt that is happening in indigenous communities in Malaysia.
Okay, thank you. And so climate change, as you've just highlighted, is a really intersectional issue. So do you think the climate movement is inclusive enough? And what can we do to make it more inclusive?
Wow. Yes, I think the climate movement, maybe I could just start off with the one that we have in Malaysia, and I'll just move on to the regional and also the global movement. So in Malaysia, it's still very much centered in urban areas. Um, a lot of groups like Klima Action Malaysia is trying hard to branch out, you know, and get into this vulnerable communities, try to get them to even speak. It's quite hard, but it has to start from there. It cannot be, you know, something that the government can do. It cannot be a top-down approach. It has to be a bottom-up approach. Somehow meet halfway with the government's initiative or something like that. But you know, the when we talk about inequalities, it has to start from the people themselves. They have to realize what is happening to them, and it has not been intersectional at all over here. Um, Partly because there's not a lot of discussions, and discourse has always been centered around emissions, energy, you know, profitability, but not much about, you know, not much about human rights, not much about gender rights, gender justice. So we're really hoping in the next few years things will start to look a bit different. It's a slow progress. When it comes to the regional scale in Southeast Asia, um, it's we can see countries like you know, the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam are doing really great work to address the different impacts of climate when it comes to, you know, public policy and health. Places like, you know, Singapore is doing amazingly well. You know, setting up different in different policies, initiatives. But then again, Singapore is considered a first world country. Um, but in terms of the people's movement, countries like the Philippines, um, understandably so, they have a really strong movement amongst the marginalized communities, because they are impacted by all these typhoons every year, and it's getting stronger, much more frequent. So the discourse is getting how do I say it? I think the discourse has hit the right chords over there, but not much so in countries like Malaysia. People still fail to see that, oh, we're going to be next, so or we already saying these changes, but we refuse to relate it to climate. You know, there's still this sort of like denialism, what is happening around us, and somehow we will be protected by all these impacts. Um, and I think globally, um, the climate discourse has also been centered around, developed nations, and I think there's an opportunity here. I think that there is a great opportunity for collaboration when it comes to the people's movement for climate, for climate action. Um, there's a greater need to understand the different ways how, the global north and global south are being impacted by climate, and trying to understand how years of, you know colonization has impacted the way how economies are being formed in global south countries. I think that understanding is not yet well communicated, but I believe there are greater opportunities, especially right now during pandemic. Even during the pandemic, we can see the vaccine inequality between the global north and the global south, and we believe that um, the pandemic will somehow pave a way for greater understanding in inequalities, and hence, it will trickle down towards the way climate action is being perceived by different by countries in the global north and the global south. Yeah, but when it comes to intersectionality, yeah, it's not much understand yet in this part of the world. Yeah.
Thank you for that. It's really, really interesting to hear. I think earlier you also mentioned Indigenous groups in other countries. Could you talk a bit more about that and whether you've worked with them and how that experience has been?
Right. I've never worked directly with them, but we have had dialogues and stakeholder meetings. For example, bringing in indigenous communities from, if I'm not mistaken, from Thailand, Vietnam, and Myanmar to come over to Malaysia, and for them to visit indigenous communities in Malaysia. So in that capacity, we offered like a platform for these communities, different indigenous communities from 4 different countries, to congregate and having them to share best practices. That's trying to, get that sense of solidarity going on, because like I said, they have problems in trusting outsiders, non-indigenous outsiders particular, and this somehow increases their confidence when they see that, oh, that particular indigenous communities are doing really well. Why are they doing really well? Maybe we can learn from them. So um, we have worked in that way, but not necessarily directly in terms of helping them, helping indigenous communities from other countries to, formulate documents or things like that. Never in that way, but always in the sense of trying to increase their understanding of each other in that sense. I think we have also been providing platforms of dialogues during the pandemic in a webinar form, um, especially to countries in, especially to Indonesia, in particular in Borneo, when it comes to the Dayak community in Kalimantan facing the forest fire. I think it's really important to strike that sense of, um, solidarity and understanding, because these are the places where the annual haze occurs in Southeast Asia, and Malaysia, our corporations have a hand in that, and we have been trying to communicate with them, but direct collaboration, for example, lobbying for their country and things like that, as it's not, Kami has not reached to that particular level, but I think it's really important for, um, for us to address um, such issues, especially when it comes to the different indigenous communities. living in that part of the world. Yeah.
So you've mentioned colonization a few times. How do
Mm.
you think that this links to climate change and what developing countries are facing?
Sorry again, your voice was breaking up.
Oh, sorry. So how do you think that this links colonization to climate change and what developing countries are facing?
You mean colonization?
Colonization, yeah, sorry.
Okay. So yes, I think it's always has always been like the sense of um, you know the global north countries. I mean, coming from I'm from Malaysia, from this kind of perspective, the global south. Um, there's a sense that um, we lack the capacity. We are not much better from the people in the global north. There's always the sense that we always come second whenever when we you know how do I say, when we request for such aid. It has always comes with another hand, hidden hand. Um, all Some of the climate finances that is being offered are being offered in loans, for example, and not in it's not being offered. How do I say this? Um, it has always been basically um, we always got the short end of the stick. That is what I wanted to say. Yeah, and developing countries do not, I cannot generalize all developing countries, but most developing countries are have been colonized before in the past. So and some of us have gotten our independence less than 100 years ago. For example, Malaysia gained our independence, if I'm not mistaken, 60, almost 60 to 60 years something ago. The same goes to um, countries like India, Pakistan, um, you know um, um, what is it called again? Indonesia, the Philippines, and we the how do I say it? The economy capacity of such countries have always we have always relied on on the relations with the proper the previous colonial masters like United Kingdom, Spain, Dutch, Germany, and I think having that independence does not only mean independence in terms of not being governed by these countries anymore, but also the way how we think, the way how we want our own people to to self-govern ourselves is quite a different thing. And and it goes to all this when it comes to all these climate negotiations. I think the global south, which is comprised of most of the developing countries, um, do not have not try their best in trying to um, get those kind of reparations, trying to get compensations for the impacts that they have felt. And yeah, I think that goes without saying. The A lot of these industries from the global north countries are still operating. It's very much highly invested in developing countries. For example, oil and gas, we have Shell, we have BP, we have Exxon, and logging, mining companies in Southeast Asia, mostly countries from the global north. And I think these are some of the impacts of colonization that's that is what it has been doing for us. Like we always rely on you know the economies from the global south, from the global north to you know somehow yeah how do I say this without sounding without offending anyone but I do agree that there's a lot of shared understanding. We have learned a lot from each other, but somehow respect is a hard thing to acquire, especially when it comes to things that has happened in the past. I think a lot of countries have still refused to acknowledge the things that's been done during the wars, during the colonization period. I think everyone knows that. So there's still a lot of mistrust. Yeah, understandably so. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So for the last 10 or so minutes, I think we'll take some questions from the chat. Thanks so much, Nadiah, for talking to us and helping us explore this complex topic of climate justice. As you've highlighted, there are so many different things to talk about. So our first question is, what do you think would need to happen in order to convince people who are currently in denial about the impacts of climate change? Do you think there's a way to convince them without the situation first getting much worse?
Wow. Do you think there's a way to convince them? Yeah, I think there's a thing with climate communications. You can't bring all the information. For example, that say that you try to build with people in the urban areas and trying to bring the same kind of conversations in vulnerable communities, understandably so. But to convince people who are currently in denial, I think in Malaysia, for example, I can just give you an example here. Whenever we, meet or having discussions with, not necessary discussions, always, devolve into something much more worse than discussions, but we try to somehow try to convince people that it's happening, the changes are happening, even though you don't believe that this is related to carbon emissions, for example, or the inequalities, but it is happening, either you believe it or not. And the loss of lives are real, it is happening. So that is somehow the entry point that we always use to get into this the climate denialism community, I would say, here in Malaysia. But there's also climate denialism, I think, there's two kind of spectrum. There's two kind of people who understood climate differently. One is they are not aware, they don't believe this is happening in this way, and the other one, they know that it's happening, but they are being denialist because they wanted to protect the status quo. So these are also two different two kinds of climate denialists out there. So there's different ways. If it's people who wanted to protect the status quo, then we would seek our actions would be far more greater than just trying to convince. We try, for example, to somehow get accountability on the table, and write all sorts of open letters trying to lobby these people. So it's quite different way of approach. Yeah.
Thank you. So we have, I think, our final question, which is from a fellow Malaysian in the chat. And so the question is, what are some ways the youth of Malaysia are able to push the climate action movement to especially the older generation in Malaysia?
Wow. I think when we say there's always this intergenerational kind of competition going on between the youth and the older generation, but I do not believe that the older generation in Malaysia are less informed about this information. They are informed, I think most of them, but um, they are somehow stuck in this current system, and they are too old to try to change the system. But I think what I would like to kind of highlight is that what we can do, you know, how we can collaborate with older generations. That is one of the things that kami, you know, one of our principles is to bridge that intergenerational gap. You know, that's why although we are a youth driven group, but we don't only have, you know, youth in our groups, you know, and it's really important to include different perspectives, people who have more experience than us, and for them to pass down this information, information that might not be available for us. For example, here in the way that we do things, we always consult with older groups, um, simply because they are far more experienced. But we have always tried to bring different way of thinking. We have always tried to disrupt the narrative, bringing in unconventional ways, new ways of thinking. I mean, that's the reason why we're having, you know, youth groups, basically always thinking in different ways. That's how you breathe new things into, you know, movement. That's how you make the movement sustainable. I think, you know, having those kind of discussion between the old and the young, you know, making sure that they pass the baton. Yeah. So
Great, thank you. I think that's all our questions for today. So lastly, we just want to say a massive thank you from me and everyone for taking the time to chat to us about this important issue. It's been really enlightening and inspiring, I think, for all of us.
thank you so much. Yes, if anyone just wanted to share, if anyone wants to get more involved in what Klima Action has been doing in Malaysia, or do you want to get in touch with anyone from this particular region in terms of, you know, collaboration, more sharing session, you can text me. Maybe I can share my email in the chat. And yeah, I'm really glad to you know, share all this information to all of you, and I hope that I have opened, yeah, certain doors and you know, the way of thinking. Yeah. All
Thank
right.
you so much.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nadia. And thank you, Hannah and Belen, for also helping us out with the hosting and everything. Really amazing to hear your input and your thought process around Malaysia and in the UK, and how we can collaborate and so on and so forth as well. And yeah, guys, everyone's got their email down there below, so feel free to message Nadia, and I'll chuck in the coordinated theme email as well in case anyone wants to message us as well. And yeah, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.